The fact that the resistance of stateless armies has proven very effective against statist armies throughout history is an argument that simultaneously bolsters the apparent feasibility of a stateless society, yet also apparently smashes the moral argument against a state. When a free market army engages in conflict with a statist army, it's called guerrilla warfare. In Iraq, the veracity of this form of defense is given a clear comparison to a statist defense. The Iraqi statist army, having an annual budget of $1.3 billion in 2002, lasted ostensibly for 41 days against the NATO statist armies, though effectively only lasted 20 days, and even that was prolonged by a sandstorm. The resources poured into the Iraqi statist army was not only significantly higher than the budget of the current guerrilla forces, but left the free market with less to work with once the state solution inevitably failed. Working with the table scraps of abandoned material from the Iraqi statist army and U.S. war materials and whatever weapons can be smuggled in from Syria and other states, the free market defense has not only been more effective than the Iraqi statist army, but may actually outlast the U.S. Army, which has not only a base budget of $481 billion, but which has an additional $218 billion devoted to campaigns in the War Against Terror, or TWAT. If the free market resistance in Iraq outlasts the U.S. statist army, it would suggest that the free market is thousands of times more efficient in military operations than a state. Other examples of free market guerrilla armies running circles around their pedigreed counterparts are/were seen in Afghanistan, Vietnam, Ireland when Britain spent hundreds of years trying to conquer it, the U.S. government's colossal failure to collect the taxation on distilled spirits and carriages in 1794, they put down the Whiskey Rebellion but couldn't collect the tax nationwide, etc. The list of guerrilla wars all throughout history is long. A guerrilla war occurs when the state solution for defense fails catastrophically, but there is still a demand for defense against the invader. In response to this demand, the free market creates PDAs, which resist, and as one would expect, the free market solution is far more efficient and is able to fight wars, and indeed does fight wars, effectively against technically superior statist opponents. Idiots, such as U.S. Army generals, call this asymmetric warfare, when really it is a rational response to the insanity of massed armies. Calling guerrilla warfare asymmetric warfare is like calling private schooling asymmetric education or guerrilla education. The success of guerrilla armies against technically superior state armies is an indictment against socialist defense, of which the commie pinkos in the U.S. Department of Defense most heartedly advocate. But this is to be expected from members of the intrusive psycho class, www.psychohistory.org, a particularly vile and gang-like mode of thought prevalent in military organizations. It is a bit unfair to expect members of a gang such as the U.S. Army, the Marines, Navy, or Air Force to think rationally about such matters, since questioning is literally beat out of the gang's members in basic training, even the officer corps. Various oaths, rituals like marching, gang symbols, eagles, the birds, crosses, tattoos, uniform clothing, hairstyle, also serve to reinforce a model of the world that is at odds with reality. Reality being that the U.S. Army, with depleted uranium tanks and Apache helicopters and satellite bombs, is getting bled dry by a bunch of inbred towelheads. The irony being that this failure is caused by going against the very free market which they purport to be defending. But this creates an apparent problem for the anarchist. If private armies are so effective, then how can states ever emerge at all? If states truly are not the product of a social contract, then how can a state ever come to be? A new state, cerebus paribus, would be like the U.S. Army trying to maintain the occupation of Iraq with the funds it extracted from the Iraqis themselves. Surely an impossible task. And so the success of free market armies on the one hand demolishes the myth that states provide effective defense, while on the other they seem to demolish the argument that the states are immoral. Because if states cannot govern people by force, as guerrilla wars suggest, then it must be by consent. Anarchic Ireland and Iceland worked peacefully for very long periods of time. Ireland was ended by Britain, Iceland by Christianity from outside, because of the common law, or points from which negotiations started, or Schelling Points. People not subscribed to the same law or police or defense agency could interact with each other just fine because everyone in Ireland started from very similar Schelling points despite being subscribed to different services. The Native Americans and the Europeans, however, came into conflict on the local level because the groups had vastly different Schelling points as they pertained to property rights. And since property rights are emergent and based on nothing more than what everyone relevant to you agrees to, different views of property rights are demonstrably important, as in differing Schelling points lead to war. This is why the Mild West was so mild. Upon embarking into more or less lawless territories, settlers knew what they were getting into, and knew they had to define property rights and law. And they started from Schelling points of existing statist property rights, although the homesteading principle was used a lot more in the anarchic West than the statist East, evidence that the U.S. statist property law back east was suboptimal. So the anarchic West saw property rights syllogistically superior than that of the statist East, which in all likelihood contributed to their lower per capita homicide rate. However, whenever the U.S. government took hold in an area, there was no opposition. There was no guerrilla war. From what little evidence we have, homicide rates typically increased when the U.S. government was imposed on an area and the emergent legal system was disbanded. And what other explanation could there be that the eventual U.S. governance was part of the Schelling points in the Westerner's mind in a way it simply is not in Iraq? An even starker example was seen in anarchic Pennsylvania. From 1684 to 1696, Pennsylvania had no effective governance. William Penn was granted governorship of what is now Pennsylvania by some sacred cow in England for who the hell knows what reason. Penn tried to raise various import duties in 1684, but some men offered to raise 500 pounds for William Penn personally instead, so as to spare the colony from crippling trade through taxation, and this proposal Penn agreed to. Hearing of Quaker persecution in England, Penn left for England. He returned to find the citizens of Pennsylvania simply weren't paying taxes at all, and that the council, which had originally existed merely to ratify Penn's wishes, had virtually taken over. Pennsylvania was self-governing, though the council rarely met and was no more effective at tax collection than Penn himself, and so Pennsylvania effectively fell into anarchy. In 1684, Pennsylvania had a population of 8,000, and in 1689 it was about 12,000, growth which occurred in anarchy, yet with no apparent chaos. However, in 1696, and there's a bunch of other stuff that I skipped, in 1696, the new governor, Markham, was able to get the council to agree upon taxation under the condition that the council would now have legislative powers itself, powers it originally didn't have. They were able to collect the taxes by pitting Quakers against non-Quakers by raising property requirements for voting, so that the typically well-off Quakers were able to vote, whereas the non-Quakers were not, and so the well-off Quakers had more clout than the typically urban poor non-Quakers. That's how they were able to get the Quakers to consent to taxation. De facto anarchy was able to reign for 14 years in Pennsylvania, but was ended, just as it was ended in the Western Territories, because the council was still deemed as legitimate. The council, while ineffectual, was never dissolved outright, and while taxation was opposed, taxation itself, in theory, was seen as something that could be legitimate, and so Pennsylvania eventually consented to it once the Quakers were cut a deal that they thought was good. The legitimacy of government was still part of the Schelling point in the minds of Pennsylvanians, and so government always had a foot in the door in the same way it had in the anarchic West. While existing in functional anarchy, Pennsylvania had no systematic justification for their system of anarchy, and so relapse was inevitable. And because the Western Territories weren't an explicitly anarchistic society, the state was still in the trade space, or the Schelling point, despite anarchy being the system that prevailed for quite some time. In Iraq, the Iraqi Governing Council is not part of the Schelling point, whereas the Pennsylvania Governing Council was. The same Schelling point, common law, emergent order, zeitgeist, ethos, or whatever you want to call it, that says we own the clothes on our body and the money in our pocket, is the same Schelling point that says a state is legitimate. This is why the U.S. government can govern something as vast as what is claimed to be the United States, but not places like Iraq or Afghanistan. That said, governance itself is a moral catastrophe, and the justifications for taxation are the most puerile, internally inconsistent nonsense you could come up with. I'm simply attempting to explain what is, not what ought to be. In order for a stateless society to be maintained, the state must be pushed out of the Schelling Point. Not only must anarchy occur, but the members of the stateless society must recognize that the state is an unnecessary evil in order to prevent a relapse that can only occur with consent, and consent that can only occur if the population doesn't have a systematic anarchistic philosophy, or at the very least understands the horrible nature of state.